Hi, this is Jim with Twisted Hobbies, and today we're going to be building the Hacker Laser 230. Okay, we are ready to go on the Laser 230 from Hacker Models. I have everything I need here. I have the model, I have the power combo, I have a receiver, and I have foam tack. My power combo comes with a prop, motor, ESC, and my servos, but does not come with anything else. So, inside of here, one of the things I really like about Hacker Models is that they have a manual inside. But I go one step further. Instead of this manual, I print out the color version. I like seeing that, or you could load it up on an iPad or something. So that's what I'm going to be following as we go through this. Let's get it on.
Okay, first thing we're going to do is open up our foam tack, open up our model, lay everything out, make sure we've got it all. Looks great. Now we're going to fold over all of our surfaces. This is a perfect time to set up the radio. So I bind the receiver, I center all the servos, I calibrate the ESC, and then I verify motor direction. There's a whole video on that in the description that you can get more detail if you'd like. Now we're going to be working with our servo horn extensions, and we're going to be pinning these together with a screw and then gluing them together with some CA. So I just used these spare screws that I had, and then I cut them off and sanded them down a little bit off camera here, and then a little bit of CA gets them all together. And next up, we're going to be working with our wing reinforcement tape, and they just have you mark it out, cut it into strips, and then install it on each wing. Typically, this is something that I forego, but they told me to do it in the manual, so I thought I'd give it a shot. So I get them all the right size, cut them out, and you just want to make sure that the wing is still able to do its full deflection and that the tape isn't keeping it from bending. So I do that on all three surfaces, and then I glue around the edge of each one just to keep down the edges. And now we're going to get out a piece of parchment paper, which I probably should have done earlier, and we're going to affix the wings to the horizontal fuselage. You'll see that I apply glue to it, I put it together, and then I pull it back apart, wait a minute, and then give it a full press for it to seal in. Now we're working on the wing spars. It's got two of them, they're the same length, and you just have to make sure that it's able to seat all the way in, especially where the joint of the glue comes in. We get a good dry fit on both of these, make sure it's seating all the way. You'll see here I had to open it up just a little more so it would fit all the way down. And then we're going to apply foam tack and get it seated all the way in place. And then we'll repeat the same process on the aft spar. And here you'll see I'm using the back of the X-Acto blade in order to push down onto the spar. That way I'm not getting glue on my fingers. Next up is going to be the horizontal fuselage stiffeners, and I dry fit those into place. Make sure and get some parchment paper underneath, fill it with some foam tack, and do that down each side. It's also important that this stays straight, so you'll see that I use a straight edge to verify that it is in fact perfectly straight. Okay, next up we're going to be working on the elevator, so we're going to need to pop out all of the pieces associated with it. The control horn here is in the hardware bag, and we're going to go ahead and mount the clevis onto it before we get everything glued together. That just makes it easier later on. We're going to thread everything onto the rod that goes all the way through. And I'm using this block of wood to sort of get it started because it's a tight fit on some of these. Some of them you do want to be a little tight, and then others you want it to be a little bit looser so that it's able to pivot through there. So I get it all set up, I measure it so that it's the same distance on both sides. Okay, this looks all set. We're going to do a final test fit to make sure everything is in the correct place, and then we'll start gluing it together. First, I'm going to glue down the sides of the fuselage. Make sure you don't get any on that carbon fiber rod or on the control horn. And then we'll glue on the elevator. Once this is all glued in place, we're going to move on to the lower half of the vertical fuselage. There's these two half-moon pieces, and that's where the struts from the wing are going to come in. And then we're just going to lay down our foam tack, press it into place, and then make sure it is at 90 degrees. Then we're going to start on the bracing for the bottom of the fuselage. I pull out all my pieces, and then I'm going to measure and cut them as per the manual. Okay, now that they're all cut, I would recommend doing a dry fit before you glue these in place. I kind of skipped the dry fit, but I have made a couple of these models before. Then we're going to go back with our square and make sure that everything is still at 90 degrees. Then we'll go and find the vertical pieces that hold the bracing for the wing. Glue those into place. And then we will locate and glue in the wing braces. They get glued in at the tips, in the middle, and then at the little black half moon at the bottom of the fuselage. The next step will be bracing and supports for the ailerons, but you may notice that I actually skipped this step on accident and had to come back and do it later. But basically you see there's a carbon fiber piece along the trailing edge, and then one goes out towards the wingtip. And then we'll be using some bracing on the aileron as well. And these braces are pretty straightforward. They just go right into place with a little bit of foam tack on each end. Do the same thing on the other side. Then once that aileron bracing is done, it is time to move on to the landing gear. We're just going to cross those and glue the ends into place. Then we're going to be finding the carbon fiber stiffener that runs vertically through the plane. It goes down between each of the landing gear legs. And then we'll use some of this supplied thread to go around this whole assembly, and then we'll use some CA glue to glue it all together. I trim off those later on. Then we'll find our other vertical stiffener, and now we're ready to install the rest of the vertical fuselage. So I run my foam tack all the way down, and we got to make sure that we have glue in the stiffener areas, so I go back and make sure that those are filled as well. Then we're checking for 90 degrees using our square, and then we're ready to move on to the vertical stabilizer and rudder. There's a carbon fiber stiffener that goes in place, and then the control horn as you see there. I usually lift up the back end of the plane a little bit, so that way when you put this part on, it doesn't sit on it and then pull it back off. So that's why I've got that tape measure under there to kind of lift it up off of the table. And then I'm just making sure that's glued in place. And here we're working on the bracing for the vertical stabilizer. Now we can glue on the tail skid. It's got a little carbon fiber reinforcement piece on it. And now we're going to put in some stiffeners that go from the front of the plane up to the little half moon support. I do trim out those little extra threads around the landing gear. I get those dry fit and then I get them glued into place. Next up, we're going to be making some internal bracing from the motor mount into the front of the plane. And you'll see that I sharpen up the ends, I scuff up the back of the motor mount, get it glued into place. And then I use my pin vise to start a little hole, and the ends of these are sharpened so they feed through, and you just get them in as far as you possibly can, fill it with some glue, and then that really helps to stiffen up the front of the plane. You just got to be careful that you're keeping it right through the middle of the EPP. It is a little bit tricky. I leave them sticking out about a half inch, a quarter inch, something like that, and then I'll trim those off later. You can see here that I'm using the pin vise to actually hold the carbon fiber that's got the tip of it sharpened, so it's kind of like a little drill, so it's like a self-tapping piece of carbon fiber. That seemed to work pretty well. Next up, we're going to be putting all the clevises onto the servo horns. And also onto the aileron control horns. We'll get those aileron control horns installed. Then we'll get all the servos installed into their servo pockets. And just make sure to think about which side you want the wires from your servos going to. And then I'll install the differential horn. Remember, the points of this go forward. Now I'm popping out all of the push rod guides. And then I'm going to thread those on first. And then I like to place each of them into their hole, and then I pull it back out a little bit, add a little foam tack, and then push it all the way in. And I'm going to hold off on gluing the push rod into the clevises because there is no adjustment on this, so I want to make sure that the model is powered on and adjusted perfectly before I get a final length on that push rod. We're going to do the same for the push rods on the ailerons. So again, I get those in place, but I have not glued them in yet. Then we'll mount the motor, the ESC, and the receiver. And then at this point, I am doing the final glue up on the clevis for the push rod on the elevator on both ends. Then we're going to go through and do the push rod for the rudder. And since the model is powered on, the servos are centered, I can finalize the length for that push rod. Then we get our ailerons to a neutral position, and then we can glue those in as well. Then we're going to glue on our little wheel skids, and then the pants. Then we're going to glue on the receiver, and then balance our prop. Then we can install our propeller, and we are done with the build. For the maiden flight, I always start with the center of gravity set at the manual recommendation. In this case, it is 227 millimeters back from the motor mount, and I'm using a 2S 450, which is about the maximum size that this plane wants. It's really an indoor plane. You can fly it outdoors as long as there's not too much wind at all, but it is a very light model, so it does tend to want to fly away in the breeze, so just be careful if you're flying it outside. As far as the Maiden goes here, I'm really just looking to see how it's balanced and make sure that it's flying true to what I think it should be. I also always include a little bit of a inverted upline test to make sure that the center of gravity is set correctly, and then I tend to do that a few more times in subsequent flights to make sure that it's all the way set. But as far as maneuverability goes, this thing is awesome. One thing you really want to check for is that your full floating elevator has full movement. So that was one thing that I was really looking at. It needs to be nice and free, because if it's binding, then you'll have some issues with it flying. But it flew exactly like I was hoping for, and I can't wait to be flying it some more. Hopefully this build video helped you, and hopefully you enjoy your Laser 230 as well.